As we know, a lot of people with multiple chemical sensitivity, MCS, share parts of their lives online on social media. We share short posts about reactions, about grief, about trying to navigate environments that make us sick, small windows into real, complex experiences. Some people share little, some share a lot, and all of it matters. But it raises an interesting question. What if alongside these everyday posts, more in-depth personal narratives about MCS also existed? There already are some memoirs about MCS, but I think there's room for many more. Not as an expectation, just as a possibility. Because for conditions that are often doubted, longer form storytelling can become another way of making lived experience visible. You're listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. I'm Aaron Goodman. In this episode, I'm joined by Roxana Delbene, PhD, a linguist and medical humanities scholar whose work explores how people with so-called contested illnesses use language and narrative to be believed. Roxana studies illness narratives and how patients construct credibility when their symptoms are real, life-altering, and often dismissed. We talk about why memoirs can function as both documentation and resistance, and how they can help inform others living with chronic illness like MCS. For this conversation, I asked Roxana about her assessment of a 1994 memoir by Australian writer Diana Crumpler, Chemical Crisis, One Woman's Story, Humanity's Future. In the book, Crumpler recounts the onset of severe physical, neurological, and sensory disturbances, her decision to retreat to the countryside in Victoria, Australia, in search of safety, and the devastating pesticide exposure that followed. Alongside the physical suffering, Crumpler describes repeated medical dismissal, a pattern that deepened her isolation and underscores the book's central message, that MCS, as we know, is widespread, poorly recognized, and woven into the fabric of modern life. Some exciting news. Please check out and share a link for the podcast's new webpage, listen.chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. It's easy to share with any MCS skeptics in your life, your doctor, employer, even family and friends. Listen.chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. And please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more, follow the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. And you can reach me by email at aaron@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Thanks for listening. Hi, Roxana. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really wonderful to be speaking with you. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself to folks?
Yes, sure. I am a linguist by training, and because of my dissertation in linguistics, in which I studied the interactions between doctors and patients with HIV/AIDS in a South American country, in a public hospital, I became very interested in their narratives. And in a new field that I learned many years later was medical humanities and narrative medicine. And that is how I later completed an MS in narrative medicine, and then a doctoral degree in medical humanities, trying to combine both the linguistic aspects, discursive aspects, and the medical humanities aspects.
And in your work, in your dissertation, you're looking at a particular kind of memoir.
Yes. In my dissertation for medical humanities, which I completed at Drew University in New Jersey, I studied different memoirs, but I focus on memoirs of people who experience what is called contested illnesses. And one of the first memoirs I studied and discovered was Chemical Crisis by Diane Crumpler. And from there, I went to other memoirs in which their authors presented similar symptoms such as chronic fatigue syndrome and chronic Lyme disease and fibromyalgia and others. It happened to me that I had a very close friend who suffered from Lyme, and her symptoms started in the 80s. And she was telling me her experience of not being believed that her symptoms were real. So that was one of the reasons that led me to start reading and then discover all these memoirs in which people, a commonality of these memoirs, although they presented different conditions, was that they were not believed. So instead of focusing on why they are not believed, which I did in part, my point was to try to see how they constructed credibility, how they made their stories legitimate. That was my topic.
Yes, yes, it's fascinating. And you dedicate your research, if I'm not mistaken, to your former roommate who had Lyme and maybe another who had chronic fatigue syndrome who's no longer alive. Is that right?
Yes, I dedicate it to my dear friend Georgia and also to other people who it happened. It's this amazing coincidence that when I was at the University of Pittsburgh and completing my dissertation in linguistics, it happened that I was living in a building apartment in which two different neighbors, they were women in their, I would say, early 40s, but at that time, they were suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome, which I didn't know what it was at the time. But I was curious enough to one of them to ask them if I could interview her for one of my papers in a course in discourse analysis. So that is how I started getting interested, and then I connected. Many years later, I connected with Lyme and the other memoirs that I was reading. Yes. So I dedicated to them. It was an amazing coincidence. Yes.
So those must have been very profound connections you had with those two particular women. Before we jump into and talk more about the memoir on MCS called Chemical Crisis, One Woman's Story, Humanity's Future, as you mentioned, by Diana Crumpler, published in 1994.
Yes.
I want to ask you more broadly, often on this podcast, I speak with toxicologists and environmental physicians and people with lived experience. What does your work bring to the discussion? What value does it have? I see enormous value in it, but for people who may not be familiar with it, why is this work important?
Yes, that is a very good question. Well, I will say that the value is in the focus on narratives. Because if you think about what a narrative is, so a narrative is in itself, a narrative exists because there has been a deviation from what is considered normal. If everything will be perfect, we wouldn't have the need to say, to tell a narrative or to write a narrative. So narratives are very powerful because they allow the person to make a plot, and the plot is a way of putting together things that seem contingent and dissimilar. So making a narrative is making a whole, and a whole, and put everything together. And by doing that, you are rewriting or rethinking and constructing your experience, and you are making sense of it.
Mm.
So I would say that in writing these memoirs, what all these different authors and patients have done is to put together and make sense of their experiences, which many deny that sense to them, and they are claiming their own perspective, but they are also reaching out to others, to their fellow sufferers, to their fellow sufferers in multi-chemical sensitivity or with chronic fatigue syndrome, etc. And they are building a community in which they can validate each other and support each other. And also memoirs have an argumentative, they are claiming an argument as well. It's not just that a person may tell their stories, but also they are making an argument. So they have one of the points is to claim credibility for what I was able to study.
Mm.
So I will say that is one of the importance of studying these memoirs, and it could be a great deal of help reading for fellow sufferers or for people who are experiencing these contested conditions. It's very helpful and therapeutic to read and also to write their own stories.
Mm. There are some memoirs focused on multiple chemical sensitivity, not that many though. And so it's interesting to hear that you first came across Diana Crumpler's book, published in 1994, which is some time ago.
Yes. I think that I discovered her memoir because when you start exploring the term contested illness, what comes immediately is the association with the Gulf War illness, and that probably I read about it, and I most likely I found that her book was cited, so I went and I got the book. Regarding Diana Crumple, you can see that she was living in Victoria, Australia. She must be now in her late 70s. It's a very comprehensive book, and I really admire her work. So, as many illness narratives of this sort, they start with the description of symptoms, the description of confusion, of what is going on, and that is getting sick, her family members getting sick. But that will be the complicating event, let's say, in narrative terms. And then the journey goes into trying to discover what makes her sick, and also what makes her husband sick and her children sick as well. And the book narrates the process and that journey in which she discovers that what happens to her is not a psychosomatic illness, as many doctors tell her, but she discovers very slowly and over the years that what she's experiencing is a reaction against the pesticides. They were living in a farm, and she describes the amount of pesticides and the fumigation that was periodically in that area.
Mm-hmm. And not necessarily on her farm, but come from airplanes and likely properties around there where they lived.
Yes, and also she tells about a neighbor who was burning plastic, and the resistance she and her husband experienced from neighbors at first, from the community at first, and that nobody was connecting, that was making them sick, was all the amount of pesticides in the farm. So very slowly she started making that connection, and the story tells us how she started getting treatment for it, and the end, as typically of these illness narratives, you don't only have the story about what happened to her, so the narrative aspect, you will also find chapters in which she explains about why there is resistance from the medical community. And there are also chapters about the chemicals and the danger of chemicals that they were used in her area, as well as resources. So many of these, and that is what actually gives a great deal of credibility to these memoirs, because it's not just the subjective point of view, but they provide a great deal of information and documentation by making reference to scientific studies, to history, like history of medicine as well.
There's a lot of research that goes into that. And I was surprised how relevant it still is today. You know, not only her experience being dismissed by healthcare providers, by physicians, but also the efforts by industry to minimize the harms that pesticides cause, which still goes on.
So one of the purposes of her book is actually to raise awareness about the danger of the pesticides in our health. Like she acknowledges that she was not that aware at the time before she started experiencing those symptoms, but certainly she became an advocate, and once I read myself the book, I also became much more aware of it.
And she writes that her body stopped tolerating modern life. And to me, it doesn't sound that surprising, given the amount of pesticides they were exposed to. And we know that pesticide is a common trigger for people with MCS. And yet she was seen as an outlier by doctors and industry and systems. And that's what strikes me as strange. You know, it's not that surprising that she got ill. Why is that so surprising to anyone?
Well, yes. Well, the thing is that this what happened to her was in the 70s. Okay, that started happening in the 70s, early 70s. The book was published, as you said, in 1994. So toward the end, I think that she received some recognition and she was treated by doctors. But she says that one of her doctors gave her the diagnosis of environmental illness. And that diagnosis was a non-conventional diagnosis. She does not clarify what year she received that diagnosis, but so we have to consider the time frame, and also, yes, there was not that much awareness in medicine of the effect of chemicals in person's health. Despite of the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, doctors were doing many tests on her. It's not that they just said it was all in your head and then they did not explore. In her case, yes, they did many tests, but and that happened with the other memoirs. In the case of I would like to mention The Widening Circle by Polly Murray, which is also an amazing story of the discovery of Lyme disease, in which the doctors did many tests, but there are, she was receiving conventional diagnosis, and like Crumpler, she was receiving some conventional diagnosis, but the treatments were not effective. So at the end, when the treatments were not effective, then that started when you are very stressed out and the psychogenetic explanations. But the fact that we need to be clear that the fact that sometimes organic evidence is not found, that doesn't mean that the person does not have a condition that has an organic biomarker. So
That's right. And that's what I found, that a lot of what Diana Crumpler describes about the misbelief and the psychologizing still happens today, because, as we know, you can't get a biomarker test easily.
Yeah, that's true. But I think things are changing. I think that you asked me about the importance of analyzing the memoirs. Well, I will say that memoirs are also contributing to raising awareness. And as much awareness we can raise, then more and more public pressure has an impact on the way diseases are, whether they are being dedicated research to them, whether they are receiving the codes that are needed for insurance and for doctors to feel comfortable being able to do a diagnosis. So memoirs are part of this popular discourse that is transforming things. And Crumble says that in the future, treating multi-chemical sensitivity as a psychogenic condition will be like treating the bloodletting that doctors used to do in 18th century. So it will be seen as a very outdated treatment, but still there is a need for more investigation and more research.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit later, but since we're on the topic, a lot of people with MCS, maybe listeners may be interested in, some are already or have written memoirs. But for those who, aren't writing or don't want to write full books, Is there value in sharing one's stories of illness on social media?
Well, I have not had that experience, but I will say that yes, more and more people are turning to social media to share about their experiences with different conditions. And I have not studied those. I have not studied those communications, so I cannot say more. But I studied the written memoirs. But I can say that there is evidence that since the 1980s, with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, what was called and the narrative boom that started in the 70s and further developed with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, was that the publication of memoirs, of stories, has had an impact on medicine, to the point that we have now a new field that is called narrative medicine, and to the point that memoirs are being studied, illness memoirs are being studied at universities. So I teach these memoirs to my students in medical humanities, and the fact that they're being taught, and not necessarily, I have to say that Crumpler was not a professional writer. She was a librarian, and I think that certainly contributed to the enormous amount of research that she has done for her book. But only few, I would say the majority, are citizens that they have an educational level of education, but they are not professional writers. So they have transformed also what is considered literature, because these illness narratives are considered part of the literature canon now.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Medicine,
as graphic memoirs.
Graphic memoirs. Yes. That they
very
were
important.
not considered a part of the literature canon in the 70s, let's say in the 80s, but they have become now considered.
So are you suggesting that people don't need to be professional writers to write a memoir on illness? You don't need to have a degree in creative writing or be a librarian. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, I would like to say that you don't have to have a degree in creative writing, although having a degree in creative writing may help you. But all of these, or the majority of these narratives, they show a great deal of preparation, a great deal of research and investigation. So to be effective and to be credible and to be able to connect your argument, most of these memoirs, although not by professional writers, they, however, show a great deal of review and preparation.
What drew me the most in Diana Crumpler's book was the parts where she explores her personal and her family's personal experience. I found the research important, but maybe it was at the time there wasn't that much available. So she wanted to combine the personal with the research. Whereas today we can find that research in scholarly papers, which are available to everyone, not all, but they're not always available to everyone, but a lot are. So what I think, in summary, I would like to see more of the personal, less research, because I think there's something really profound in just sharing one's lived experience. I wonder if you have any thoughts on on that, on just the power of the lived experience?
Well, but I would say that she does that because there is an interplay, an intermingling of the personal, subjective narrative with the informative. One of the I would say one of the strategies that is, I think, a very good strategy is that all the scientific background that she presents, she connects it with her personal experience and her family's experience. So by reading her book and all others illness memoirs, they are so appealing because you are not reading just the dry scientific exposition, but it is the scientific exposition comes connected to with a purpose. It comes to illustrate and to support her personal experience. So that is my way of reading it, perhaps.
100%. I like how you framed that, the interplay and the connection. Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you, oftentimes even the name, there are many names for this illness, but one of the most common is multiple chemical sensitivity. And a lot of people take issue with that because we know it's a lot more than being sensitive. Yeah. And for you, when you read Crumpler's book, do you have a sense that Crumpler communicates MCS as a disability more than just a sensitivity?
Well, very interesting question. I would say that she mostly uses the words environmental illnesses and ecological illnesses. And what in terms of a disability, I would say that she does not construct herself as a disabled person at all. Although she tells us that she has to live in isolation practically with her husband, but they had to build they had to accommodate a great deal their house for her not to be exposed to external chemicals from the street, for instance. But you can see in reading her book, there is a vibrant person who has actually found purpose in writing and in helping others and being involved with the community. And now with the advances of Zoom and the telecommunications, I think that she may be doing that more and more. So I don't think she constructs herself as disabled, but she warns about the challenges and the risks of disability to the whole humanity if chemicals are not being controlled and people are not being educated about the damage of chemicals.
Yes. And if doctors and perhaps regulators and policymakers were to read this book, what do you think they would take away? What do you think they would learn about MCS?
Well, two things come to mind right now. First of all, and one of the things that raised my awareness when I read her book a few years ago for the first time was her awareness in the fact that we are not separate from nature. That what kills an ant, what kills a mosquito is the ant, the mosquito, the grass are not that separate from us. So what affects them they may affect us in the long run if it's not immediately. So we are not separate from nature. We are part of it. And what kills other animals and plants in nature may affect us as well. And that is one thing. And the other thing that I think, I'm not a medical doctor, but I can see that it could have an impact, is that Crumble advocates for medical imagination and for the power of observation. She emphasized the importance of paying attention to what nature is telling us. And certainly the combination of what the patient is saying to what the doctor can find, so that both perspectives are not separate, but they need to be reconciled, because the patient also has a great deal of knowledge about their bodies. So the patient's knowledge about their bodies need to be reconciled with the doctor's knowledge.
When we think of the medical dismissal that Crumpler experienced, how do you view that? Do you think it added layers of suffering for her and her family on top of the illness? And then was writing the memoir sort of an effort to claim her voice, to push back against that?
Yes, that brought her a great deal of suffering, but at the same time brought a great deal of self-determination. I'm going to find out what is this about, what is happening. And there is a period for many sufferers of congestive illnesses, and Crumble experienced that as well, that they self-doubt, because and that I observe in all the memoirs I have studied with different conditions, like a chronic Lyme, for instance, or chronic fatigue syndrome. There is a period of self-doubt, because when doctors are saying I cannot find anything organic, and that must be stress, that must be all in your head, then there is a period of self-doubt that they say, well, this can happen? Yes. How come? And there is, with this self-doubt, there is a period of depression as well. So yes, it causes a great deal of suffering. But at the same time, she was seeing that not only herself, was her children, was her husband, and also later the neighbors in that rural area in which they were living. So her attitude was of strength and trying to find out what was going on.
That self-doubt is something that I've heard others talk about. And I sometimes experience that myself. How could it be that I'm reacting so severely to one breath of fragrance when everyone else in the space seems to be fine? How could I be, disabled for days by this? It seems it's hard to understand, but it is real. It is real. And often when I don't have a reaction for days, I can fool myself into thinking that I don't have MCS, but it only takes another reaction to remind myself, oh yes, I still do.
When about what you describe of your experience, that sometimes you don't have a reaction for some days, so that makes you believe that, well, it's in your head, that you won't have a reaction. But she says, and you wonder, how can you be so different that you are, there are perhaps other people in the same room where you are, and others don't have that sensitivity, but you do. And one of the comparisons that Crumpler says is that if we all will be allergic to eating apples, then it will not be a problem. But she says our bodies do not respond in that manner. So for some, even though it's so strange, for some, eating apples could trigger allergic or sensitive reactions. And yes, it is strange because we are used to consider that we had to live in this normality baseline, and if we move far away from that medium, from that media, from that mean, then something is strange with us. But if you consider it as, well, that is the way, that is your makeup, that is the way you are, and you have to accept it, and listen to your body and respect your body. Yes, it is not fun, I believe, and that makes you feel singled out, but you have to consider that everybody is different.
Everyone's different.
But medicine treats everybody as the same, because there is some part of it can be understood that medicine has to consider the mean, and because we need a point of comparison.
And I think if there are millions, we know there are millions of people with MCS. So we're no longer outliers. We're not a majority yet, but we're not alone. And I think when we're singled out by others or judged, sometimes I feel like, what if they knew everyone's trajectory is different, and just because they didn't have the same as mine, I think that's where they don't understand. They just assume everyone had the same experiences, but they don't.
Right. Exactly. And I want to, if you don't mind, I would like to point out something about the term sensitivity, because sensitivity, my concern with the term multi-chemical sensitivity is that sensitivity could be constructed as a negative connotation, but actually sensitivity should have, in my view, a good connotation. Because, and this is something, actually, there is another illness memoir that I recommend. It's not about multi-chemical sensitivity. It's about other conditions. It's from Sarah Ramey, The Lady's Handbook for Her Mysterious Illness. And she claims the concept of sensitivity as a good thing, because someone has to call attention to the problems, and people now who experience multi-chemical sensitivity, they are the canaries in the mine. So they are telling us that if this is happening to me now, it may happen to you in the future. So they are warning us. Yes.
You've been listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. I'm the host and podcast creator, Aaron Goodman. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast is by and for the MCS community. The podcast is generously supported by the Marilyn Brockman Hoffman Foundation and listeners like you. If you wish to support the podcast, please visit chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Your support will help us continue making the podcast available and creating greater awareness about MCS. Some exciting news, as I mentioned off the top. Please check out and share a link for the podcast's new webpage. Listen www.chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. To learn more about the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast, follow the podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. And as always, you can reach me at aaron@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Thanks for listening. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast and its associated website are the work of Aaron Goodman, made possible with funds from the Marilyn Brockman Hoffman Foundation, supporting efforts to educate and inform physicians, scientists, and the public about multiple chemical sensitivity. The content, opinions, findings, statements, and recommendations expressed in this Chemical Sensitivity Podcast and associated website do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of its sponsors.